You've all read Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece. For those of you, the younger people in the crowd, if you haven't read Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, The End of History, which was published in 1989 in the National Interest, you should really read it and read it carefully. It's an article, I think it's the most important article that has ever been written in the United States in terms of influencing foreign policy and influencing how the American foreign policy elite thinks. I believed at the time that it was a remarkably foolish argument, and that it would be proved wrong, and I do believe it has been proved wrong. But it's an argument that says we, the United States, played the principal role in defeating fascism in the first half of the 20th century. And then in the second half of the 20th century, we played the principal role defeating communism. And now the only viable political system that was left was liberal democracy. And in fact, what was going to happen with the passage of time was that the entire planet would end up being comprised of liberal democracies. Liberal democracy was the wave of the future. In a way, what Frank was saying in this famous piece is that the Americans have the wind at their back. History is on our side, even though he was talking about the end of history, right? We have the wind at our back. And Frank said that once the planet is populated with nothing but liberal democracies, there'll be no war, there'll be no conflict of any consequence. And he says explicitly in the piece that the biggest problem that we will face is boredom. Just think about that. And this line of argument is what underpinned engagement. The idea was that if you engage with China, right, the end result would be that China would become a liberal democracy, and again, we'd live happily ever after. NATO expansion. Most of you young people in the audience probably don't appreciate this, but NATO expansion up until 2014 was not aimed at containing Russia. It was designed to spread the liberal political order and economic order that had been established in Western Europe during the Cold War into Eastern Europe. This is why Vladimir Putin was invited to the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit. NATO expansion into Ukraine was not designed to contain Vladimir Putin. I told you, he was viewed as remarkably weak. Russia was viewed as remarkably weak, and we were trying to push NATO expansion down the Russians' throat, right? So what we were doing was, it was liberal hegemony. We wanted the Hungarians to join NATO and to join the EU, because you would then be joining institutions and you would become rule-abiding citizens. Furthermore, if you joined the EU, you got integrated into Western Europe, you become prosperous. And you did become prosperous. And furthermore, we wanted to make sure you became a liberal democracy. Many Hungarians, of course, complain bitterly about the fact that the Americans and the West, more generally, are trying to push liberalism on them. Yes, but that was part of the strategy, right? Liberal democracy in Hungary, prosperous Hungary, Hungary that's embedded in institutions. This is what we wanted to do with Ukraine. It's what we wanted to do with Poland, right? And the idea was, once we did that, we'd all live happily ever after. The real monkey wrench in the operation were the Russians, right? And we didn't think the Russians mattered that much. The Bush Doctrine in the Middle East. The Bush Doctrine was designed to turn the Middle East into a sea of democracies. When we invaded Iraq, we thought that Iraq was not the last stop on the train line. We thought we'd have to do Syria, maybe Iran, but eventually everybody would see how powerful we are, throw their hands up, surrender, and the Middle East would democratize. Frank Fukuyama told us that was going to happen. Fascism was dead, communism was dead, authoritarian governments, nah. We're talking about liberal democracy here, there, and everywhere. And this is the road that we went down. And it was a disaster, right? NATO expansion led to the war in Ukraine, in my opinion, as I laid it out here. The wars in the Middle East to foster democracy, they worked out really well. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, geez, the amount of murder and mayhem that we helped create in the Middle East. And China, we created a peer competitor, right? This was liberal hegemony. But the point I made is that that's in the rearview mirror now. Rhetorically, it's not, because that's the velvet glove. You want to remember, the Americans will continue to talk like liberals and act like realists, because we're playing hardball now, because we have two great power adversaries, and we're in a very dangerous situation.